Imagine you are standing on a windswept hill in Denmark. You're looking down at the cold, gray water of a fjord, and the wind is just whipping past your ears.
Right, it looks like this completely peaceful, untouched landscape.
Exactly. It looks totally serene. But beneath your feet, buried deep in the earth, is a phantom ship. And I mean, not just any ship, it's a massive cutting-edge warship.
Holding the ghost of a king.
Yeah, a king whose very name was violently erased from history. So today on the deep dive, we aren't just looking at, dusty archaeological artifacts. We are stepping into an active 1,000-year-old crime scene.
We really are.
We're trying to figure out who this missing king was, how he built this untouchable naval empire, and why his enemies were so terrified of his legacy that they literally tried to delete his existence from the earth.
It is the ultimate historical cold case. I mean, what we have here is an entire narrative of immense power, staggering wealth,
And profound disrespect.
yes, profound, calculated disrespect. And it's all been frozen in the soil since around the year 925 AD. What makes this so captivating for us is that we are looking at this through an incredible stack of sources.
Right, the documentation is wild.
It is. We've got detailed archaeological reports, chemical soil analyses, historical records, and even modern naval reconstructions of the Ladby ship burial.
And, 925 AD is such a specific, volatile window of time to be looking at, right?
Oh, absolutely. It is a powder keg of a century. We are talking about the period just before Denmark became a unified, centralized kingdom.
Under Harold Bluetooth.
Exactly, under Harold
Yeah.
Bluetooth. So if you picture the landscape before that unification, it wasn't a neat country with borders.
Right, not at all.
It was dominated by these fierce regional powerhouses, chieftains and local kings who ruled their specific territories through a very precarious mix of, well, naval supremacy, immense wealth, and these strategic, often ruthless alliances.
Which means the man we are focusing on today, a figure we only know as the Ladby King, he was one of those powerhouses.
He was a major player.
Yeah, so to understand why someone would eventually, drag his massive warship up a hill and bury it, we really need to understand the man himself and the specific geography he completely dominated.
That's the perfect place to start.
So let's talk about his headquarters. His seat of power was a place called Bike.
Yeah, so if you want to understand the Ladby King, you really have to look at the map of the island of Finan. He controlled the eastern coast.
Specifically near the Kerteminde Fjord, right?
Exactly. And Bike is this very prominent hill that overlooks a body of water called the Kerteminde Fjord.
And a nor is basically just a shallow enclosed bay, right? Or an inlet.
Yeah, exactly, a shallow inlet. So when archaeologists started digging around the top of this hill, they found the post-hole impressions for a massive timber haul.
And when you say massive,
We are talking 8 meters wide by 26 meters long.
okay, let me just translate that into modern terms for you listening, because that's huge. 26 meters is nearly 85 feet long.
It's enormous.
That is roughly the length of a professional basketball court, built entirely of massive, heavy timber, just sitting at the peak of a hill.
Right. And a structure of that sheer scale, it wasn't just a dwelling.
No, of course not.
It was a theater of power. It was the administrative and social heart of the kingdom. I mean, this is where alliances were forged over roaring fires, where grand feasts were held to secure loyalty.
And where the king's elite retinue of warriors lived and bonded, I imagine.
Exactly. But the hall itself is really only half the genius of Munkebo. The real genius is the geography it overlooked.
View.
The view and the control. If you stand at that hall, you have a perfect vantage point over the Great Belt.
Which is the crucial, heavily trafficked strait separating the major Danish islands.
Right, and from up there, you completely control the narrow entrance to the fjord below.
And he didn't just, passively sit up there and watch the water. The archaeological record shows he actively choked it off.
This is one of the most fascinating parts.
Yeah, they discovered the remains of a pile barrier built right into the water at the narrowest point of the inlet.
They literally drove massive, sharpened wooden stakes deep into the seabed,
Just to restrict and control access to the bay.
which effectively turned the waters right below his royal hall into a highly secure private winter harbor for his naval fleet.
I am so glad you brought that up because, when you read about Vikings in popular culture or you see them in movies,
They're always raiders.
they're almost always portrayed as these chaotic, nomadic raiders. They just show up on a beach, swing some axes, steal the silver, and leave.
Right, the hit-and-run tactic.
But looking at the infrastructure of Munkebo, it completely shatters that image. I mean, this feels less like a pirate camp and more like a 10th century toll booth combined with the Pentagon.
The Pentagon analogy is incredibly apt, actually,
Right.
because building and maintaining an 85-foot administrative hall and then engineering underwater pile barriers, it requires a massive level of permanent bureaucracy and military strategy.
It's not just a bunch of guys with axes.
Not at all. Controlling that narrow entrance meant the Ladby King controlled the trade routes. In the early 10th century, true wealth wasn't just hoarding silver.
It was the tolls.
Exactly. It was the ability to protect trade and extract tolls from everyone passing through. That pile barrier meant his own fleets could safely winter there, completely protected from North Sea storms.
And rival raids.
Yes. While any outsider attempting to pass had to pay the king's price.
So you really have to picture this. You are this unnamed king, right? Standing in the doorway of your massive timber hall. The freezing winter is setting in, and you are looking down at the water.
It's a powerful image.
You watch your fleets, dozens of heavily armed ships, safely navigating through the narrow, secret opening of your pile barrier, coming home to harbor. You are completely untouchable in your fortress.
But, and this is the key to project that kind of untouchable power across the Baltic Sea in the first place, you need something more than just a safe harbor.
Right, you need a way to enforce your will on the open ocean.
Exactly. The king's power relied entirely on his naval superiority. And that brings us to the centerpiece of this entire deep dive, the Ladby ship itself.
This ship.
The vessel they found buried was not a standard transport boat. It was a highly specialized, cutting-edge machine of war.
Let's get into the engineering specs because this honestly blew my mind. The ship measured 21.5 meters long.
About 70 feet.
Yeah, 70 feet. And just 3 meters wide at its widest point. It was built firmly in the Scandinavian longship tradition.
Specifically, what they call a langskib. Longships were engineered to maximize 3 specific things: speed, agility, and a very shallow draft.
And that shallow draft meant they could sail deep into inland river systems, right? Or
Sure.
right up onto surprisingly shallow beaches without running aground.
Which is exactly what made Viking forces so terrifyingly unpredictable. They could strike anywhere. And they achieved this using the clinker method of construction.
Okay, for those of you who aren't master boat builders, the clinker method basically means the hull is made of oak planks that overlap each other at the edges, sort of like the wooden siding on a house.
That's a good way to picture it. And they are fastened together with iron rivets.
But what is truly wild here is how thin those planks were. I mean, the oak boards making up this 70-foot warship were only about 2 to 2.5 centimeters thick.
Less than an inch.
Less than an inch thick. For a warship.
It sounds dangerously fragile, I know. But that thinness is actually the secret to its brilliance.
How so?
It gave the ship immense flexibility and kept the overall weight incredibly light. Instead of rigidly smashing through the heavy ocean waves like a modern ship.
Oh, it would flex.
Exactly. A clinker-built hull could literally flex, undulate, and ride over the water.
That is insane.
Inside the hull, the builders placed 17 wooden ribs, spaced exactly 90 centimeters apart.
And that spacing isn't just a random measurement, is it?
Not at all. 90 centimeters is the precise ergonomic distance required for an oarsman to pull a full stroke without hitting the back of the guy rowing in front of him.
Of course.
So with 17 ribs, you have 15 to 16 pairs of oars.
That means the Ladby King was commanding a highly trained crew of about 30 to 32 rowers.
Capable of moving that ship at terrifying speeds, even when there was no wind for the sail.
Okay, here is the part of the engineering that I really want to unpack, because there is a massive physics problem with a 70-foot ship made of inch-thick, overlapping planks.
There's a huge physics problem.
If you are out in the choppy waters of the Great Belt, and your ship is constantly flexing over the waves, how do you stop the entire hull from just snapping in half under the mechanical stress?
The stress on a hull of that length is immense, especially right along the waterline.
Right.
Think about the invisible forces at play here. The water is constantly pushing inward against the sides. The heavy weight of 32 men and their cargo is pushing downward.
And the waves.
And the massive ocean waves are actively trying to bend the ship longitudinally, meaning end to end. If the hull is completely uniform in its thinness, that stress will inevitably find a weak point. The wood will splinter and the ship will go down.
So their solution to this was a specific piece of engineering called the Meganhove, which roughly translates to the strong plank.
Yes, the Meganhove.
It was located right at the 4th row of planks up from the keel, right where the water hits. And unlike the rest of the hull, this plank was carved to be much thicker and narrower.
That's right.
When I was reading the structural reports, the best way I could picture this was imagining a lightweight, carbon fiber race car.
Oh, interesting analogy.
Yeah, so you keep the overall body incredibly light, so it's crazy fast, but you build in this one reinforced steel chassis spine right where the stress is highest, so the car doesn't rip itself apart when you hit a tight corner at 200 miles an hour.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. But if we take your race car analogy a step further, imagine if that reinforced steel chassis also had to actively twist and bend every time the car hit a bump without permanently deforming.
Wow. Yeah, that's next level engineering.
The Megenhofer absorbed and distributed the longitudinal stress of the waves along the entire length of the ship. It allowed the vessel to remain light and flexible enough to survive the open ocean while maintaining its structural integrity.
Which is proof positive that the Ladby ship was an active, violently capable warship, not just some decorative ceremonial barge built purely to look pretty in a grave.
Exactly. And if anyone needs more proof of how functional this ship was, we just have to look at the anchor.
Oh man, the anchor! When I read the specs on this anchor, it genuinely sounded like modern industrial equipment.
It is a truly remarkable artifact. Located in the portside bow area of the grave, archaeologists uncovered a massive wrought iron anchor standing 1.26 meters high.
That is over 4 feet tall, making it the largest anchor ever found in Scandinavian antiquity.
But it's not just the size of the anchor that's impressive, it's the chain attached to it.
Right. They found an 11-meter-long chain that's over 36 feet, made entirely of high-quality Norwegian iron.
In a time when almost every other ship on the water was using hemp or bast rope for their anchors.
So the Ladby King had 36 feet of heavy iron chain. Why go to that kind of extreme expense?
Well, there are two massive implications here. The first is pure economic flexing.
Just show off.
Pretty much. Iron was an incredibly precious, labor-intensive commodity in the 10th century. Sourcing high-quality iron from Norway and paying a master blacksmith to forge 11 meters of heavy interlocking chain was an astronomical expense.
It was a floating display of wealth.
But practically, an iron chain provides what sailors call a spring effect.
Right, because rope floats.
Exactly. A buoyant rope pulls straight up on the anchor from the ship, but a heavy iron chain sinks.
So it changes the angle of the pull.
Right. The weight of the chain drops down and forms a catenary curve in the water, pulling the angle of the anchor down flat against the seabed. That horizontal pull helps the flukes of the anchor dig firmly into the sand or mud, creating a vastly more secure hold in rough weather.
And they didn't stop there. They actually forged swivels into the chain.
Wrought iron swivel.
Think about a modern climbing carabiner, or the little spinning joint on your dog's leash that stops it from getting tangled up.
Yes.
When a 70-foot ship is anchored in a narrow tidal fjord, the water doesn't just flow one way. The tide comes in, the tide goes out, and the ship swings in massive circles.
And if you have a solid fixed iron chain, what happens?
It kinks, it twists, and eventually the sheer torque of a 70-foot ship spinning in the current will snap those iron links like twigs.
But a swivel allows the chain to spin freely, absorbing the rotational force without tangling.
The inclusion of those swivels is hard, undeniable proof of extreme maritime sophistication.
It tells us that the shipbuilders and the sailors understood the invisible, dynamic rotational forces of the sea, and they engineered complex mechanical solutions to overcome them.
And the cool thing is, we actually don't have to just imagine what this incredible machine looked like, because between 2011 and 2016, the Viking Museum Ladby built a full-scale functioning reconstruction.
The Ladby drag, nor the Ladby drag.
Which was a massive undertaking in experimental archaeology.
Oh, absolutely. They didn't just guess at the dimensions. They used highly precise 3D measurements taken from the original archaeological imprint.
And perhaps the most surprising detail came from microscopic soil analysis of the original 1935 excavation trench.
Yes, analysts found surviving traces of pigment in the dirt.
Which completely upends the Hollywood aesthetic, doesn't it?
It really does.
When we see Viking ships in movies, they are always this dark, brooding, untreated black wood. But the microscopic pigment proves the Ladby ship was painted vibrant blue and yellow using linseed oil paint.
Blue and yellow, with a massive 65 square meter linen sail.
Wow.
And the modern researchers who actually sail the Ladby Dragon today have reported some fascinating insights. They note that while the ship is incredibly fast and agile in the sheltered inland waters of Funen, its low profile, what we call a low freeboard, means that taking it out into the choppy open sea requires immense expert handling.
So it's risky.
Very. One slightly miscalculated maneuver against a wave, and the water comes pouring right over the side. It really highlights the sheer terrifying skill of the sailors who manned it 1,000 years ago.
So we have this beautiful, terrifying, brightly painted machine of war, and that makes its final destination all the more shocking to me.
How so?
Because the ultimate display of the Ladby King's power wasn't sailing this ship into a glorious naval battle, it was taking it completely out of its element.
Ah, yes.
When the king died around 925 AD, his followers didn't just dig a neat little grave. They took his 70-foot, perfectly functional, state-of-the-art warship and they dragged it onto dry land.
They hauled at a distance of about 300 feet from the edge of the Kerteminde Fjord up an incline to rest on a prominent ridge.
I mean, if you, the listener, have ever tried to push a broken-down car out of an intersection, think about that burning muscle fatigue. Now multiply that sheer, agonizing physical effort by 1,000.
It's hard to even fathom.
You are dragging a 70-foot oak warship weighing tons up a 300-foot hill with no modern mechanics. You'd need massive wooden rollers, teams of oxen, and hundreds of men hauling on heavy ropes.
The exertion, the noise, the sheer chaos of that effort is mind-boggling.
And that exertion was entirely the point, wasn't it?
Exactly. You don't undertake an operation like that quietly. It was a highly visible, incredibly loud public performance of power.
A statement.
By agonizingly dragging the ship onto this high ridge, they were actively creating a monument that would dominate the skyline for anyone navigating the strategically vital fjord below.
It was an unmistakable message to every passing trader, and more importantly to every rival chieftain, basically saying, the dynasty that built this ship still controls this land, our power does not die with one man.
And the way they positioned it in the earth wasn't random either. They didn't just drag it up there and let it tip over on its side.
No, they dug a trench and placed the ship perfectly keeled down, plumb and level, as if it were sitting in the water.
That orientation is a vital piece of the psychological and religious puzzle. Keel-down placement directly reflects Norse cosmological beliefs.
So it wasn't just a coffin.
Right. To the people burying him, this ship was not merely a large wooden coffin. It was quite literally the vessel for the king's soul.
Wow.
By keeping it perfectly upright, they were ensuring it was poised for immediate departure on his journey into the afterlife.
And then they constructed a sturdy wooden burial chamber right in the stern of the ship for the king's body, filled the vessel with provisions, and buried the entire thing under a massive, looming earthen mound.
And there it sat in the dark. For an entire millennia.
An entire millennium. The 85-foot timber hull up at Munkebo Bake slowly rotted away. The power dynamics of Denmark violently shifted. Harald Bluetooth unified the country. The Viking Age faded into the medieval era.
And the Ladby ship just sat silently under a fertile hill.
Until the year 1935.
Yes, the discovery of the ship is one of the great accidental triumphs and, frankly, greatest technical challenges of Danish archaeology.
It started with a man named Paul Helweg Mikkelsen, who was a pharmacist by trade.
Right, a pharmacist, but a highly skilled amateur archaeologist from the nearby city of Odense. He and his son were out surveying the area when they noticed something highly unusual in the loamy topsoil of the mound.
Heavily rusted iron rivets and fragments of what looked like spearheads.
Which prompted the Danish National Museum to send out a professional conservator named Gustav Rosenberg to lead a full-scale excavation.
But the second Rosenberg broke ground, he realized they were facing a completely terrifying archaeological nightmare.
The issue was the soil chemistry. The earth on the island of Fenen is highly acidic.
And over 1,000 years, what does that do?
Well, over the course of 1,000 years, that acid had systematically decomposed every single piece of organic material on the ship.
So the wood was gone?
Completely gone. The oak hull planks, the massive wooden mast, the deck boards, the wooden shields, all of it was completely gone. It had literally been eaten by the earth.
Let's just pause there because this is the part that feels like absolute magic to me. If the wood is completely gone, what exactly were they excavating?
That's the beauty of it. They were essentially excavating a shadow.
A shadow.
The soil of the mound had packed down so incredibly tightly around the ship over the centuries that when the wood eventually rotted away, it left a perfect three-dimensional mold of the ship's hull stamped into the clay and sand.
And perfectly suspended in the walls of that dirt mold were more than 2,000 iron rivets and clench nails, still sitting in the exact positions where they had been driven into the vanished wood 1,000 years prior.
The level of patience required for this excavation is almost impossible to overstate. Rosenberg and his team had to delicately brush away the soil millimeter by millimeter,
just to map the exact coordinates of over 2,000 rusty rivets without accidentally collapsing the fragile 70-foot dirt imprint of the hull.
Exactly. And as you might imagine, the tension in the trench between the amateur and the professional was incredibly high.
Right, because you have Mikkelsen, the enthusiastic amateur guy who discovered the site, and Rosenberg, the clinical, deeply skeptical scientist from the capital.
And they actually got into a massive, heated debate right there in the dirt.
Over the stem of the ship, right.
Yeah, they were working near the front of the ship, the bow section, and Mikkelsen found these very strange, coiled iron artifacts.
He immediately pointed at them and insisted these have to be part of a stem, part of a carved figurehead.
But Rosenberg looked at the dirt and refused to believe it. He didn't want to jump to any romantic mythological conclusions without hard scientific proof.
But the Earth provided the proof.
It did. As they spent hours carefully brushing away the acidic soil around those artifacts, a very clear pattern emerged.
They uncovered an unbroken 60-centimeter line of tightly coiled iron spirals. Mikkelsen was absolutely right.
Yes, these iron spirals were the ornamental curls of a dragon's mane.
That is just incredible. The intricately carved wooden dragon head had completely dissolved into nothingness centuries ago, but the iron mane was still sitting there in the dirt, perfectly tracing the arc of the invisible beast's neck.
Imagine being in that trench in 1935. You are brushing away dirt to reveal a ghost ship outlined entirely by floating rust, and suddenly you uncover the iron mane of an invisible dragon staring back at you.
It is a beautiful synergy between an amateur's bold intuition and a professional's rigorous methodology. Because they managed to work through their disagreements, they preserved that delicate imprint so perfectly that it provided the exact blueprints the museum needed to build the 3D reconstruction decades later.
And preserving that internal space was vital because the ghost ship wasn't an empty vessel.
Right, they had to provision it.
When the ship was put into the ground in 925 AD, the king's followers had to outfit it. If the king was heading into the afterlife, the Norse belief system dictated that he needed the exact aristocratic lifestyle he enjoyed at Munkebo to come with him into eternity.
Which brings us to the grave goods and the sacrifices. And I have to warn you, the listener, the word sacrifice here takes on a staggering, almost unbelievable scale. Let's look at what the osteological evidence, meaning the careful study of the bone fragments left behind in the acidic soil, actually tells us.
The most prominent feature of the burial isn't just gold or silver, it's what they found packed into the bowel section of the ship.
Right, the animals.
The bones revealed the remains of 4 to 5 dogs and 11 horses.
The dogs were of varying sizes, which the bone structures suggest were a mix of slender hunting hounds and heavier, muscular guard dogs, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
But the horses are the truly staggering element. The skeletal measurements show they were of a smaller stature, very similar to the rugged, sturdy build of modern Icelandic horses.
Wait, hold on. 11 horses.
Oh, wow.
I was picturing maybe one faithful steed or maybe
Okay.
a pair of horses to pull a chariot. In a 10th century agricultural and military economy, what does it actually mean to permanently remove 11 prime horses from your workforce and bury them in the dirt? That sounds economically ruinous.
It is an incredible destruction of wealth.
Really?
If we want to understand the impact, you have to think of a prime 10th century horse, not just as an animal, but as a machine of war, a vital vehicle for travel, and a supreme status symbol, all rolled into one.
This is huge.
To put it in modern terms, it would be like a billionaire dying today and his heirs taking 11 brand new Ferraris, driving them into a ditch and burying them in cement just to prove they could afford the loss.
Wow.
Slaughtering 11 horses was a massive, deliberate, agonizing loss of capital for the king's heirs to absorb.
It is the ultimate economic flex. It's a broadcast to the entire region saying, our dynasty is so incredibly rich and our dominance is so secure that we can afford to kill 11 of our finest assets just to outfit our father for the afterlife, and it won't even dent our power.
Precisely. And studies of the wear patterns on the horse teeth show these were not old, broken-down nags.
They were healthy.
These were prime, healthy specimens. One horse was even singled out and interred, wearing its full, elaborately decorated harness.
And interestingly, the spatial arrangement here tells us a lot about local culture, doesn't it?
It does. Placing the slaughtered animals directly inside the bow of the ship contrasts sharply with contemporary ship burials found over in Norway.
Oh, where did they put them in Norway?
In Norwegian burials, sacrificed animals were typically placed outside the hull in the surrounding earth. This indicates a very specific, localized variation in the religious ritual of providing the deceased with his spectral retinue.
And he wasn't just bringing his animals, he was bringing the trappings of his immense wealth. Even though the grave was violently plundered later, which we will definitely spend time unpacking, the tiny fragments of artifacts that the robbers missed paint a picture of ridiculous luxury.
Absolute luxury.
The archaeologists found shreds of clothing that had actual physical gold and silver threads intricately sewn directly into the fabric. So the king was laid to rest wearing these glittering, heavy ceremonial robes, and they found a solid silver belt buckle.
His armament for the afterlife was also highly comprehensive. Just outside the ship's hull, they found a bundled quiver of 45 lancelet arrowheads.
And for you listening, lanceolate means they were shaped like miniature lance heads, tapering to a sharp, leaf-like point, designed specifically to pierce armor.
45 of those represents a serious investment in long-range warfare. Inside the chamber, they found a small, lethal axe and the heavy iron boss of a wooden shield for close-quarters melee combat.
And connecting back to the horses, they didn't just throw the animals in naked. They included 3 completely intact sets of riding gear.
Bridles, iron bits, cheek pieces, stirrup irons, and even a whip with a beautifully crafted silver handle.
It proves that the Ladby King wasn't just a sea king who only knew the deck of a ship. He was a landed lord who dominated the battlefield on horseback as well.
But we shouldn't just picture a bloodthirsty warlord. The domestic and social items left in the grave show a deeply refined side of his life.
Like what?
Well, they found a partially gilded silver plate and a high-quality bronze dish, which points to the high-status diplomatic feasting that would have happened up in that 85-foot hall.
Right, entertaining guests.
They also found 2 large wooden buckets bound with iron hoops and finely decorated personal knives.
But my absolute favorite detail from the entire grave inventory is the leisure equipment.
The board game.
Yes. Amidst the weapons and the sacrificed horses, they found fragments of a strategic gaming board, probably something like Nefertov, which is often called Viking chess.
The inclusion of the board game is a spectacular detail because it deeply humanizes the Ladby King.
Right, he's playing games.
Nefertov is an asymmetrical game of pure strategy, where a king piece is surrounded by attackers and has to escape to the corners of the board. Finding this game in his grave shows a lifestyle of high-status leisure, certainly, but also highlights a mind trained for tactical thinking.
He was a strategist.
He was a man who anticipated his opponent's moves, whether he was moving wooden pegs by a warm fire in his hall or maneuvering fleets in the treacherous political landscape of 10th century Denmark.
So if we put all these pieces together, we have this incredibly vivid image. A brilliant tactical mind, dressed in shimmering gold-threaded robes, wearing a silver belt buckle, surrounded by his loyal hunting dogs, 11 of his finest horses, his armor-piercing arrows, and his gilded silver tableware. All of it resting inside a state-of-the-art warship, suspended perfectly upright in the earth, ready to sail into eternity.
It is a perfect, undisturbed capsule of supreme power. Except it wasn't undisturbed.
Right. Because as we mentioned at the start of the deep dive, there is a glaring, violent hole in the center of this story.
The king himself.
The king is missing. We have the massive ship, we have the dozens of sacrificed animals, we have the gold thread and the arrowheads, but we do not have the king. The king's body, and presumably his main weapon, his sword, are completely gone.
The forensic evidence pulled from the mound is absolutely chilling. When you look at how the layers of soil were disturbed, the archaeological record proves unequivocally that the grave was reopened from the top down.
And this didn't happen centuries later by random, opportunistic grave robbers who stumble across the mound, right?
No. The stratigraphy of the soil indicates it happened within just a few decades of the initial burial.
But how can archaeologists be so sure it wasn't just a crew of local thieves looking to score some silver in the middle of the night?
Because of the highly specific way the breach was executed and the deeply strange inventory of what was left behind. When the excavators carefully dug down into the stern of the ship, where the wooden burial chamber was located, they found it hadn't just been looted. It had been systematically dismantled.
The light wooden deck covering the burial space had been forcefully ripped open from above. And whoever went down into that dark chamber dropped something very specific on their way out. In a hastily filled ditch near the edge of the mound, archaeologists found a single iron ring that had 6 miniature Thor's hammers attached to it.
Just dropped in the dirt.
Was it a clumsy mistake during a hasty escape? Or was it a deliberate pagan warding symbol left behind by the intruders to protect themselves from the angry ghost of the king?
We don't know for sure, but we do know exactly what they did when they got inside the chamber.
Oh, did they do?
They entirely removed the king's physical skeletal remains. Not a single human bone was left. And they removed his sword.
Which would have been the ultimate personalized symbol of his martial authority.
But here is where the simple robbery theory falls apart. They took the body and the sword, but they left the solid silver belt buckle.
And the gold threads.
Right, and they left the clothing interwoven with pure gold threads. If you are a thief risking your life to break into a haunted royal mound purely for wealth, why on earth would you leave the easily transportable silver and gold?
Exactly, it makes no sense. And the forensics get even darker from there. They didn't just take his body and leave, they engaged in what archaeologists call the needless shattering.
Yes, the shattering.
The intruders took the remaining domestic goods in the grave and violently chopped them into hundreds of tiny pieces. They took those simple wooden buckets we mentioned earlier and hacked them into useless splinters with an axe. Why do that?
This specific pattern of destruction brings us to the competing historical theories of why the mound was breached.
Okay, let's hear them.
For a long time, some scholars proposed what they called the translation theory.
Meaning moving the body.
Right. The idea was that as Christianity rapidly spread through Denmark in the decades following 925 AD, perhaps the king's newly converted descendants respectfully reopened the mound, carefully removed their pagan ancestor's body, and translated or relocated him to be reburied in a newly consecrated Christian churchyard.
Okay, let's play that out for a second. If you are a loving grandson, respectfully relocating your grandfather's remains to a holy churchyard to save his soul, does that process usually involve taking an axe and violently hacking his favorite wooden buckets to pieces in a dark hole?
It absolutely does not. The intense, visceral violence of the act thoroughly undermines the translation theory. The prevailing academic interpretation today, heavily supported by researchers like Anne C. Sorensen, is the symbolic rivalry theory.
The symbolic rivalry.
This wasn't a pious relocation, and it certainly wasn't a smash-and-grab robbery. It was a calculated act of political iconoclasm.
It's essentially a 10th century political smear campaign, combined with deliberately wiping a rival's hard drive so their data is gone forever.
Right.
It is targeted, aggressive erasure.
You have to step back and remember what that 70-foot ship on the hill represented. It was a massive, highly visible monument broadcasting the absolute legitimacy and unshakable power of the Ladby King's bloodline.
Right, everyone could see it.
If you are a rival chieftain looking to take over Funense, an agent of the aggressively expanding Gelling dynasty under Harold Bluetooth, or perhaps an operative during the later vicious succession struggles between Harold and his son, Sane Forkbeard, you can't just defeat the current army.
You have to break the bloodline's foundational legitimacy.
Exactly. So you don't just kill his descendants, you attack the revered ancestor directly. You order your men to dig into the mound, probably in broad daylight so everyone sees it.
You haul the patriarch's decaying body out of his sacred chamber and drag it out into the open to completely humiliate him.
You steal his sword to publicly revoke his military command.
And you deliberately smash his belongings to splinters to insult his spirit and deny him his high-status lifestyle in the afterlife.
It was a brutal public demonstration of total dominance. It was intended to psychologically devastate the king's surviving descendants and permanently erase the legacy of a competitor.
By physically removing his body and destroying his grave goods, they were declaring to the entire region that the new sovereign was the only true power in the land, and the Ladby King was nothing.
A total calculated erasure.
It's just a brutal, horrifying strategy. They literally tried to delete him from existence. But the ultimate irony of this deep dive is that they completely failed.
They really did.
Because despite this incredibly violent, calculated attempt to erase him, the Ladby King left an indelible mark on Danish history. And that brings us to the legacy of the art and the modern reconstruction efforts.
He absolutely did leave a mark, and we can see that mark most clearly in the tiny fragments of art that somehow survived the desecration.
Even in its shattered state, the Ladby find is actually considered a cornerstone of Viking art history. It provides critical, datable evidence for the spread of a specific artistic movement we call the Gelling style.
Right, and for context, there's the older boar style.
Oh, right, with the tight geometric knotwork and those weird, almost cartoonish, gripping beasts with cat-like faces.
Yes, exactly. And then later on, you have the mammon style, which is very flamboyant, featuring full-bodied animals tangled in plant tendrils, which was heavily influenced by incoming Christian motifs.
But right in the middle, bridging the gap between the old pagan geometry and the new European flair, is the Gelling style.
And the Gelling style is visually distinct. It is characterized by beautiful, ribbon-shaped, intertwined animal bodies that form elegant, flowing S-shaped curves.
And the animals typically have beaded bodies and are depicted with sharp profile heads, right?
Yes. The defining artifact for this style at the Ladby site is a beautiful gilded bronze harness link, which was part of a dog leash found down in the dirt among the dog skeletons.
A dog leash. I mean, the man was so wealthy that even his dog walking gear was a masterpiece of contemporary cutting-edge art.
But the presence of that specific artistic style on his dog leash is incredibly important from a geopolitical standpoint.
What does it tell us?
It proves that the Ladby King wasn't some isolated, backwards, local warlords clinging to old traditions. He was plugged into an elite, highly connected international network that shared the absolute latest artistic tastes across the Baltic and the North Sea.
So he was a culturally sophisticated monarch.
Absolutely.
And that sophistication, that incredible, violent, cinematic narrative of his life and death is something modern people have gone to truly extraordinary lengths to honor. In 2011, a group of 16 dedicated embroiderers started a project to create what is now known as the Ladby Tapestry.
It is a monumental undertaking of modern craft.
It took those 16 volunteers 6 full years of painstaking microscopic hand embroidery to create a continuous 7-meter-long narrative textile work.
Just picture over 22 feet of solid embroidery.
Mm-hmm.
It is structured into 7 distinct stories, functioning kind of like a gorgeous, intricate medieval comic strip.
It starts by depicting the chieftain's life at his great hall, showing his unchallenged rule over East Funen. Then it shows the agonizing labor of hauling that massive ship up the hill, followed by the bloody sacrifice of the horses and the dogs.
It even has this deeply beautiful mythological section showing the king's soul navigating the intense religious tension between these old Asa faith, the Norse gods, and the slowly incoming Christian religion.
And what makes the tapestry so powerful is that it doesn't shy away from the dark history. The 4th panel graphically depicts the desecration, the violent breach of the mound by rivals, and the brutal removal of the body.
Meanwhile, the smaller friezes running along the top and bottom borders detail the sheer blisters and sweat labor of 10th century shipbuilding and rope making.
And finally, the tapestry honors the 1935 discovery by Mikkelsen and Rosenberg, bringing the story right up out of the dirt to the modern museum and the hands of the embroiderers themselves.
If you think about that for a second, it really hits home.
It really does. Think about you, the listener, navigating your life and the incredible amount of energy we all spend just trying to ensure we are remembered by our friends, our family, our colleagues. And here we have 16 modern human beings pouring 6 years of their lives, thousands of hours of meticulous labor into honoring a man who died over 1,000 years ago.
A man whose very name we don't even know.
The tapestry serves a vital, almost magical function. It bridges the gap between the clinical, scientific data, the 2,000 rusty iron rivets, the fragmented horse bones, the acidic soil chemistry, and the visceral, emotional, deeply human storytelling of the Viking Age. It breathes the life back into the ghost ship.
And the best part is that you can actually go see all of this in one place. The Viking Museum Ladby has evolved dramatically from that simple, damp concrete vault they built over the dirt imprint back in 1937.
It has grown into a massive cultural institution. They have all the surviving artifacts on display, including the dragon's mane spirals and the Thor's hammer ring.
They have built a fully reconstructed Viking farm to show what daily life looked like.
And most importantly, it remains the only place in the entire world where an actual Viking ship burial can be seen in situ.
Which is an archaeological term, meaning in its original place. The ship hasn't been dug up and moved to a sterile museum in a capital city. It is preserved exactly where the ritual took place.
When you visit, you walk into the dark, climate-controlled atmosphere of the original burial mound, and you are standing on the exact geographic coordinates where the king's followers stood in 925 AD. You are looking down at the actual imprint in the original Earth.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's take a step back and look at the sheer scale of the journey we just took.
We started 85 feet up in the massive timber hall at Munkibobak, looking down at a heavily fortified winter harbor protected by underwater spikes.
We explored the genius, cutting-edge naval engineering of a 70-foot warship, marveling at its flexible Meganhofer and its heavy iron anchor swivels.
We felt the sheer, back-breaking agony of dragging that ship 300 feet up a hill just to prove a point. We analyzed the staggering wealth of the grave, the gold thread, the silver tableware, the sheer economic devastation of 11 sacrificed horses.
And we walked through the violent, highly political crime scene of the desecrated burial chamber.
And all of that serves as a stark, powerful reminder that history isn't just a neat record of the solid objects that survived the centuries.
History is just as often written in the negative space. It is defined by the shadows, by the imprints in the dirt, and by the things that angry people desperately tried to destroy.
The empty space where the Ladby King's body should be tells us just as much about the ruthless, violent formation of the Danish state as the triumphant, heavily carved runestones at Jellingdu.
It really does.
Which leaves me with one final thought for you to carry with you. I want you to picture those rival chieftains, whoever they were, hacking their way through the wooden roof of that burial chamber.
They drag the king's body out into the dirt.
They steal his legendary sword. They take an axe and chop his wooden buckets and his gaming board to splinters. They did all of that grueling, hateful work to erase his power forever, to ensure he would be entirely forgotten, reduced to nothing more than a footnote beneath the glory of the new kings.
But, and this is the incredible part, by doing so, by violently breaking in and leaving behind that shattered wood, the dropped Thor's hammer ring, and the glaring empty space in the stern of the ship, they accidentally created a completely unique, wildly compelling forensic crime scene.
It is exactly that violent mystery, that desperate attempt at erasure, that ensures we are sitting here today, over 1,000 years later, deeply fascinated by the exact man they tried to make us forget. So who really won?